There is a concept in military planning called the culminating point. It is the moment in an offensive operation when the attacking force has expended so much energy, so much supply, so much momentum that it can no longer advance and becomes almost instantly vulnerable to a counterattack it no longer has the strength to absorb. Napoleon reached his culminating point outside Moscow in 1812. The German Wehrmacht reached it at Stalingrad in 1942. Every great offensive in the history of warfare has had one. The art of command is knowing where that point is for your enemy and for yourself before you reach it. The question that serious analysts are now asking, quietly, carefully, in the language of people who understand the consequences of being wrong, is whether Russia is approaching its culminating point in Ukraine. Not a military collapse, not a dramatic battlefield reversal, something subtler and, in many ways, more dangerous. A slow structural degradation of the capacity to sustain the fight. Not enough fuel, not enough revenue, not enough political cohesion at home to absorb the cost of a war that was supposed to be over in 72 hours and is now measured in years. The drone campaign targeting Russian oil infrastructure is not separate from that question. It is central to it. Every refinery that burns, every pipeline that shuts down for emergency repair, every percentage point shaved off Russian energy export revenue moves that culminating point closer, not by months, perhaps by weeks, perhaps by days in the aggregate, compounded across a budget that is already being stretched beyond its design tolerances by the cost of a war that has consumed men and materiel at a rate that even the most hawkish projections did not fully anticipate. And here is the thing about culminating points that most people never learn until it is too late. You do not always see them when they arrive. They do not announce themselves. One morning, the offensive simply stops. And by the time the commanders on the other side realize what has happened, the opportunity to exploit it is already closing. The leaders who win wars are the ones who see that moment coming, who position themselves to act the instant it arrives, who have done the unglamorous, painstaking, inglorious work of preparation. Not the heroic charge, not the dramatic speech, not the moment the cameras love, but the months of planning, the nights of analysis, the decisions to strike a refinery at 3 a.m. when the world is asleep and nobody is watching, and the only witness to your discipline is the mission itself. I have lived that kind of leadership. I have demanded it of the men and women who served under me, and I will tell you something about it that does not fit on a motivational poster. It is lonely, it is relentless, and it is the only kind that actually works. Now let us talk about something that the coverage of this conflict almost never addresses. Because the strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, as strategically significant as they are, do not exist in isolation. They exist inside a web of pressures that are simultaneously military, economic, political, and psychological. And the interaction between those pressures is where the real story lives. Think about what Russia is managing right now at this moment in the conflict. On the military front, it is conducting large-scale offensive operations across a front line that stretches for over 1,000 kilometers, at enormous cost in personnel and equipment. On the economic front, it is operating under a sanctions regime that has severed it from the most sophisticated financial and technological systems in the world, forcing improvisation and substitution at every level of its industrial base. On the energy front, it is now absorbing a sustained campaign against the very infrastructure that generates the revenue that funds everything else. And on the political front, it is attempting to maintain domestic cohesion in a country where the full cost of the war is being actively concealed from the population, which means every drone that reaches Russian territory, every fire visible from a Russian city, every explosion heard by Russian civilians in the night is not just a military event. It is a crack in the narrative. That crack matters enormously, and here is why. Authoritarian systems, and I have studied them, operated against them, and in some cases worked alongside them across 4 decades of service, derive their stability not from popularity, but from the perception of invincibility. The moment that perception fractures, The moment ordinary citizens begin to ask not, will we win, but can we actually be hurt, the internal calculus of the regime begins to shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, but inexorably. A government that cannot protect its own citizens from attack, that cannot shield its own industrial heartland from fire, that cannot keep the lights on at its airports and the air clear above its capital, that government faces a legitimacy question that no amount of state media can fully answer. Drones over Moscow, fires visible from Russian cities, airports in the Russian capital ground to a halt at midnight. These are not tactical footnotes. These are strategic communications, delivered not in words, but in smoke and light and the sound of explosions in places where explosions were never supposed to reach. And if you think the leadership in Kyiv does not understand that dimension of this campaign, if you think these strikes are chosen purely on the basis of fuel output disruption, then you are underestimating the sophistication of the people who are fighting this war on the Ukrainian side, because they have read the same history I have read. They have studied the same conflicts. They know that wars are won in the minds of populations and the offices of presidents long before they are won on the battlefield. And they are conducting this campaign on every level simultaneously. But I need to be honest with you about something, because honesty is the only currency a leader can afford to spend freely. This campaign comes at a cost. Everything in war does. The night that saw fires over Ryazan and drones over Moscow was also the night after Russia killed 21 civilians in Kyiv with its own missile strike. 21 people. And the night before that, and the night before that, and in an unbroken chain of violence stretching back to the first hours of the invasion, Ukrainian civilians have been dying. Cities have been reduced to rubble. Hospitals have been struck. Schools have been struck. The human cost of this war does not belong to one side. It accumulates on both sides, on civilian populations who did not choose any of this, who simply had the misfortune of living inside the geography of other people's ambitions. I say this not to create false equivalence between an aggressor and a nation defending its existence. I say it because leadership without moral clarity is not leadership. It is management with better weapons. And moral clarity in a conflict of this complexity requires holding two things in your mind at the same time: the legitimacy of resistance and the cost of that resistance, measured not in strategic objectives, but in human lives. The greatest commanders I have ever known, the ones who could look you in the eye on the far side of an operation and still sleep at night, were the ones who never lost sight of that cost, who felt it, who carried it, who let it make them more precise, more disciplined, more deliberate, not more reckless, not more numb. Because the moment you stop feeling the weight of the decision to send people into harm's way, you have stopped being a leader. You have become something else, something far more dangerous. That is the standard I am asking you to hold yourself to, in whatever arena you operate, in whatever decisions you face. Now, let us talk about where this goes. Because a burning refinery, a drone campaign, a war in Eastern Europe, these are not abstract geopolitical events. They have direct consequences that reach into the global economy, into the energy markets, into the cost of goods on shelves in cities on every continent. When Russian oil production is disrupted, even partially, even temporarily, it moves prices. It shifts supply chains. It forces governments to recalculate their energy dependencies and their strategic relationships. Every finance minister in every capital that imports energy is watching the smoke over Ryazan and running numbers. And that global economic dimension is precisely why this conflict will not be resolved by military means alone. It will be resolved, when it is resolved, by a combination of battlefield realities, economic exhaustion, political will, and diplomatic architecture. The drone strikes are one instrument in a much larger ensemble. They matter not just because they damage refineries, but because they change calculations. They change what negotiating parties believe is possible, what they believe is sustainable, and what they believe the cost of continued conflict will ultimately be compared to the cost of an agreement. Every serious negotiation in the history of modern warfare has been preceded by a period in which one or both sides was made to genuinely feel the unsustainability of the status quo. The drone campaign is part of making that feeling real for Moscow. Not comfortable, not distant, not something that happens only to soldiers at the front. Real, present, smelling of smoke. And here is what that means for you. I am not just talking about geopolitics. I am talking about a principle of leadership and strategy that applies directly to every challenge you face in your organization, in your career, in the battles you are fighting right now that have nothing to do with drones or refineries. The principle is this: the most powerful thing you can do to change a situation is not to attack the most visible part of it. It is to identify what sustains it, what fuels it, what finances it, what gives it the will to continue, and apply your effort there, consistently, patiently, with discipline that outlasts the other side's confidence that you can be worn down. Ukraine did not have the conventional military power to defeat Russia head-to-head in an armored exchange, so it did not try to fight that war. It found the vulnerabilities that conventional power leaves exposed: the long, indefensible energy infrastructure, the psychological comfort of a home front that believed itself untouchable, and it applied pressure there, methodically, month after month, strike after strike. That is asymmetric thinking. And asymmetric thinking is not just a military concept. It is the defining characteristic of every underdog that has ever beaten the odds, every startup that has ever disrupted an incumbent, every leader who has ever walked into a room outgunned, outspent, and outranked, and walked out having changed the outcome anyway. You do not win by fighting on your enemy's terms. You win by refusing to. But asymmetric thinking requires something that is genuinely hard. It requires that you resist the pressure to respond visibly when what is needed is to act effectively. Those are not the same thing. The visible response, the dramatic counterstrike, the press conference, the headline, is almost always less strategically valuable than the patient, disciplined, invisible accumulation of pressure at the point that actually matters. I have watched leaders destroy careers and organizations by confusing the response that looked decisive with the response that was decisive. They are almost never the same decision. The one that looks decisive in the moment is usually the one that feels good. The one that is actually decisive is usually the one that is hard to explain, hard to defend in the short term, and absolutely correct in the long term. Discipline is the bridge between those two options. Discipline, not talent, not resources, not connections, not luck, is the variable that separates outcomes. And discipline at the level we are talking about does not come from motivation. Let me be very clear about that. Motivation is a feeling. It rises and falls. It is highest when the stakes feel exciting and lowest when the work is grinding and the results are invisible and you have been at it for months without the validation you were promised. I have never met a special operations soldier who relied on motivation to complete a mission. I have met thousands who relied on training, on standard operating procedures, on the habits built so deeply into the body and the mind that they execute correctly even when every emotional signal is telling them to stop. That is what Ukraine has built. Not enthusiasm, capacity, institutional capacity to sustain a campaign, a military, economic, and psychological campaign at tempo, under fire, with incomplete information against an adversary that has every structural advantage except the one that matters most in a long war. Will. The will to keep going. The will to absorb the blow and respond. The will to look at 21 bodies in a city that was supposed to be safe and decide that the answer is not surrender, but preparation. The will to launch 355 drones in a single night and be ready to do it again the next night and the night after that. That kind of will is not natural. It is not born. It is built. It is built by leaders who refuse to let their people believe the mission is optional. It is built by institutions that treat accountability as a non-negotiable rather than a preference. It is built in the moments that nobody records and nobody celebrates. The planning session at 2 in the morning. The decision to continue when continuing is the harder choice. The refusal to accept a comfortable answer when the truth is uncomfortable. And I want to leave you with this. The world is full of conflicts, not all of them military, not all of them geopolitical, where the side with more resources, more conventional power, more institutional inertia, more of everything that looks like strength on a spreadsheet is losing or will lose because they are fighting the wrong war, because they are optimizing for the visible metric rather than the decisive one, because they have confused size with strength and comfort with readiness. The lesson of a burning refinery in the pre-dawn hours of a May morning is not that drones are powerful. The lesson is that clarity of purpose, applied with discipline, at the point of genuine vulnerability, over sufficient time, changes outcomes that looked fixed. It disrupts systems that looked unassailable. It puts smoke in the sky above cities that believe themselves beyond reach. That lesson does not belong only to Ukraine. It does not belong only to military strategy. It belongs to anyone who is facing something larger than themselves and has decided that the size of the obstacle is not a reason to stop. Make your bed. Know your mission. Find the refinery and strike it every single night until the war is won.